Welcome to Washington in Focus, your source for the week's top stories in the state of Washington. I'm Cole Lauterbach, managing editor for the Center Square Newswire service. This week, we will be discussing a proposed energy rebate, but Washingtonians would only get it if they vote to keep the state's carbon auction. Seattle's mayor saying tax hikes are not the answer to the city's budget hole. A bill in Olympia that allows the state to pull funding from schools if they don't allow some literature that's seen as pornographic, and a roundup of the quickly growing field of candidates looking to succeed Congresswoman Kathy McMorris Rodgers. That's ahead on Washington in Focus. I'm Cole Lauterbach.
Some people would call him a loser. He ran for state office. He was beaten. He started a business. He failed. He ran for Congress. He lost. He was nominated for vice president. He lost again. But he knew only those who never tried are the real losers. And Abraham Lincoln was no loser. Persistence. Pass it on. From the Foundation for a Better Life at values.com.
Welcome back to Washington in Focus. I'm Cole Lauterbach now. Let's jump into the headlines. Washington Democrats are proposing a $200 energy rebate, but there are some high-stakes political strings attached. Editor Brett Davis joins me to tell me more about the two proposals. Brett?
These proposals, they don't help the environment per se. What each proposed supplemental budget, the House version and the Senate version does is provide $150 million for a one-time $200 energy rebate voucher from utilities and the like to low and moderate income households.
And that's, this, how is this paid for then? Is it money that's coming, did you mention, it comes from the carbon auction? I mean, one thing we've heard is that there's the guardrails around that carbon auction money that it must go towards environmental issues. How does a $200 check help the environment?
Well, it doesn't really, in all honesty.
Okay. Well, and then also the question then becomes, with the cost of saving of gas having gone up around 50 cents per gallon, largely, widely now blamed on the carbon auction, how far does $200 go towards making up for that extra cost on Washington travelers?
So not very much, according to Republican critics. At a media availability event earlier this week, Senator John Braun, he noted that these vouchers might cover fuel costs for 1, maybe 2 months if you're lucky. But he asked, what about the other 10 months of the year? What are people supposed to do then? $200 doesn't go very far in this economy.
They seem to be doing a victory lap over the proposal.
Absolutely.
Could you tell me what they had been saying?
So at the aforementioned news conference, Republicans noted that this energy rebate voucher plan is basically a de facto admission that the carbon auctions mandated by the Climate Commitment Act are impacting people in terms of high fuel costs. Rep. Chris Corey, he pointed out that Washington has the third highest gas prices in the nation. And he basically said this energy rebate plan is an acknowledgement of a problem. That is, it's, causing high energy costs.
And the timing of this seems, I know that what one of the lawmakers called it fishy, but they were throwing labels of quid pro quo at the ideas of doing so, right?
So the Republicans had a field day with the timing and optics of the House supplemental budget proposal. Now, the Senate version requires that rebate checks or vouchers be sent out in 2024, so this year. The House version, on the other hand, it says that half of the funding shall be dispersed by the Department of Commerce to each utility on October 15th of this year, with the other half sent out by February 15th of 2025, unless, and this is the interesting part, Initiative 2117 to repeal the Climate Commitment Act is passed by voters. Senator John Braun used the word electioneering. Representative Drew Stokesbury, as you mentioned earlier, called it suspicious. He noted that, getting money right before and after an election in which the second payment is contingent upon how people voted on the initiative is not a sign of good government.
Right. It's, at its very base sense, it's, if you vote this way, we will give you more money. And I mean, I've seen the rationale behind it, but how did Democrats respond to these claims? Because they took to the podium after Republicans had made these allegations.
Yeah, so Stokesbury's comments were brought up at the Democrats news conference. Representative Joe Fitzgibbon, he took a swing at it, and he said, and this is a quote from him, "I would be interested to see how Representative Stokesbury would propose to pay for that rebate if the revenue from the Climate Commitment Act stops coming in December. It would not be responsible budgeting for us to make a promise that we can't keep," end quote. Then he went on to mention all the other things the CCA pays for besides these rebates, forest health, wildfire prevention, salmon habitat recovery, traffic safety. He said he wanted to make sure people knew the revenue to pay for these things could go away. I thought that was an interesting comment. I mean, he's acting as if the CCA coalesced out of the ether just now, when in fact it was passed by the legislature in 2021 and signed into law by the governor then. And it, went into effect at the beginning of last year. So this isn't, this is something that just happened out of thin air.
And it's not like before 2021, they just suddenly, they never took any of those steps prior, right. Like, wildlife service, working to help the salmon habitat. Those things were to an extent in place. Granted, to their credit, what they did was use that money to boost those environmentalist ideas. Right. But at the same time, it seems a little disingenuous when I've seen there was one lawmaker online that said if the CCA goes away, we're going to have to stop infrastructure projects. On its face, it makes you question because the carbon auction revenue specifically, the legislation says it cannot go towards things like infrastructure, right. Like base general costs, correct?
Correct. And one wonders, how do they pay for this stuff to begin with? I mean, this is a fairly new revenue stream and hasn't been around for a long time.
All right. Yeah, we will track this as it continues to move on. Thank you, Brett. Now on to the city of Seattle, where they're facing more than $200 million in a budget deficit. They've taken the emergency action to stop the bleeding, but are now tasked with crafting a new budget under the light of this shortfall. Seattle reporter Spencer Pauly joins me. Spencer, how did the city find itself in such a hole in the first place?
Well, the city basically continued spending more than it was taking in, even as the COVID pandemic occurred. During that time, the city heavily relied on federal COVID relief dollars to kind of plug that gap and avoid any kind of cuts to city departments and whatnot. However, that federal COVID relief money has drained. And so now the city is trying to find other ways to address this gap.
And we've seen a lot of other cities do this as well. They use the COVID relief funds to fund new programs or expansions of existing programs, but still with the tacit admission in some cases that we understand we're going to have to figure this out once this one-time spending dries up. And, now it's time to pay the piper, essentially. And as a city CEO, Mayor Harrell has a lot of levers he can pull, which includes new revenue streams, increasing level of taxes that already exist. He's said that this is not on the table at this point.
That's right. Yeah. During his State of the City address that occurred earlier this week, he hit all the main talking points he said in the past: improving public safety, increasing the city's affordable housing stock, addressing the fentanyl crisis, etc. But he also mentioned the $229 million budget gap that the city is facing. And what he said was, quote, "While there are some who would suggest that the answer lies simply in new revenue, the fact is that passing a new or expanded tax will not address the fundamental issues needed to close this gap in the long run," end quote. So that tells you enough right there that, mayor is not looking at more revenue sources, but kind of looking deep within the budget, seeing what can be addressed to, shrink this gap.
Now, this sounds like a change of tune. Do you think this most recent sea change on the city council, where you saw a lot of the incumbents, the very, very progressive sitting, city council members being ousted and being replaced with much more, still Democrats, but very moderate, I guess they were coined business Democrats by the Seattle Times in a few occasions. Do you see that as a reflection, as a part of this decision by Harrell?
Absolutely. And I'll provide this quick little statistic in that since 2018, the Seattle City Council approved new taxes totaling over $700 million annually. Now, the new city council, we're saying it's a huge change, and a lot of them kind of align with the mayor's strategies he's looking to implement within the city. And even during Mayor Harrell's State of the City address, he even said that a lot of these council members share his office's goals and strategies. And you're seeing that already. The one council member, Bob Kettle, has his 6 pillars of public safety strategy, in which looking at how to address shortages in the Seattle Police Department, staffing shortages, and improving public safety there is just one example. But a lot of the new council members here look like they are aligning with Mayor Harrell's left-leaning ideas, but definitely more moderate stance, I would say.
And what that also reflects to public opinion, where in Seattle and Washington in general, you see far and away to the councilman's top pillars is public safety and crime are far and away the most important issue to Seattleites today. Right. And it's, and a lot of these people that have, are saying this represents a change of opinion. In the past, it was, environmental issues or other things that, darlings of, the progressive movement would look at and say, those are our bread and butter issues. So I wonder if it's also just kind of putting his finger in the air and listening to what people have to say, and following that lead. Now, what is the city?
I was going to say recent surveys have showed that, a lot of the Seattle residents' opinions have shifted to prioritizing public safety and addressing the homelessness issue. This has changed since the COVID pandemic when we started to see crime increase within the city. And you're just looking at these surveys that were provided by the Seattle Chamber of Commerce shows that, the city is looking to change from a more progressive leaning stance and shifting more to the right, I suppose.
I think it falls under what you've seen as the hierarchy of needs, where, you can care about social issues. Climate change is a very alarming thing. But if at the same time you are not safe to live your life in the place where you live, that is going to take precedent. It's human nature. If you don't feel safe for your family, that becomes priority one. And then you can worry about climate change tomorrow, essentially. Now, what has the city already done in terms of slowing the spending over projected revenue, even before the budget's been bandied about?
The city of Seattle previously created a revenue stabilization group to figure out strategies to address this huge budget gap. And I have to laugh because ultimately the group offered 9 new tax ideas to address this, like creating a new capital gains tax within the city or an estate tax. Another example is increasing the city's jumpstart payroll tax. But that kind of contradicts what Seattle Mayor Harrell just said in his State of the City address, where he's not looking to do that. So I think they haven't addressed it yet, but what we can expect in the future is maybe hints at maybe cuts to city departments, staff layoffs. We haven't heard that quite yet, but I think that would be the next thing we see on the table here.
And the budget the budget as is still seeing, as we've seen before, it's got record high levels of revenue in terms of the previous years, with the only exception being the fact that the COVID money is no longer flowing from the federal government. Now, when, Spencer, does the new budget have to be enacted?
The city's going to have to start their budget talks this coming November, and we'll have to pass it by the end of the year. Usually they pass it middle December, and this is going to be the new biennial budget. The city has a 2-year budget, of course, and we are on the second year of the current one. So it's going to be a long haul, and we're already starting discussions I see this week with the Seattle's budget committee already talking about the budget gap already. So we'll see how it goes as the year goes on. But by the time November hits, we'll see what exactly the city is going to do, whether it's cuts to, staff levels, cuts to department funding. We'll find out by then.
Thank you, Spencer. It'll be a long summer. Off to Olympia, where Capitol reporter Carlene Johnson has the story of a bill that would allow the state's top education official to cripple a local school district budget if they refuse to allow students exposure to what's been seen in some controversial reading. Carlene, could you start off by giving a better description of what this measure does than I obviously could?
Well, the bill would give a statewide executive branch level, the superintendent of public instruction, currently Chris Rakedall, some new authority to cut the funding of any school that he deems is not requiring OSPI, Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, curriculum that goes far enough concerning critical race theory, really controversial, DEI teachings, diversity, equity, and inclusion, or queer theory lessons in the classroom. In addition, sex ed curriculums that also include gender-based teaching. And so this is kind of going backwards on what OSPI said a few years ago when they initially passed the bill that said you're going to have total local control.
This does kind of represent a change in course. Now, with your best radio veteran PG filter, give listeners an idea about what type of books are involved here.
Well, yeah, it's books, and it's an edition beyond the books, there would be videos and other acceptable curriculum. So the idea from Republicans is, okay, you can teach sex ed. If we're going to throw some gender teaching in there, that kind of a thing, that's fine. But let's kind of keep it maybe at least PG. There was an amendment offered this week by Republican Senator Jim McCune from Graham that would prohibit school districts from approving any kind of instructional materials that he said are lewd, obscene, or pornographic. And at one point, he asked the chair, Democrat Lisa Wellman, he said, I've got printouts from 3 of these more obscene books that are part of some of these approved curriculums, and they're already in school libraries. He said, may I read from this? And she hesitated for several seconds and said, okay. And then he said,
oh boy.
And then he said, never mind. I can't read from them. They are too obscene and too pornographic. One of the books he referred to has been, in the media quite a bit, Jack of Hearts and Other Parts. I wouldn't feel comfortable reading from that. But, the term FU in these books 128 times in just one of these books, and this is acceptable material in middle schools. That's what's concerned so many parents.
It is kind of an artful political move. She kind of called his bluff, said, sure, go on the record. I want to hear you say some of these things. But yeah, it's enough to make you feel a little uncomfortable. Now, were there calls for local control for elected officials in this debate? Because that was really like you mentioned, at the beginning of this conversation where they, started instituting this, it was still, hands off. Local elected officials will be the final say. Was that addressed, that change of course, Carlene?
Well, they certainly discussed that in some of the public hearings, but at no point did the public hearings include a school board official saying, wait a minute, you're taking away our control. There were other organizations that spoke to that. But that is the concern in here. Just from my perspective, I'm thinking, say you've got a more conservative school board, right? An elected school board. So they're representative of the community and the children that are in those schools. If you've got one activist board member, or maybe even middle of the road in an otherwise conservative school board, that one member could certainly go to OSPI and say, you know what? The curriculum that we're currently using doesn't include enough race-based teaching, or doesn't include enough gender-based teaching, or we're not going far enough with sex ed in our elementary schools. If that board member then solicited an opinion from OSPI, and OSPI said, you're right, you guys aren't going far enough, that's it. That new, more expansive curriculum, if you will, has to be adopted then by the school board, and upon an amendment from a Democrat that was also offered during the same hearing earlier this week, Cole, the school board then would parents have an option of appealing for a minimum of 3 years.
So say a school in Grant County takes a stand and says, I don't want this, we don't want this, and they would be reported, and OSPI deems them out of line with this new proposal for 3 years. Would have their funding cut?
Yeah, there's a little bit of ambiguity as far as what the funding cut levels are in there, because it sounds like there would be a series of, okay, you're out of compliance, use this curriculum. If they still refuse, there might be a step, that goes further, and then ultimately funding is cut. And what I've been hearing from parents is the concern of going, okay, so we're forced to adopt this curriculum that's going to say, go way further than I wanted. And now there's no avenue to appeal, whether it comes from the school board or a concerned community member or a parent of a kid in that district. For 3 full years, they would have to keep that curriculum that OSPI approved.
All right. We will definitely track this bill as it wrangles its way through the legislature. Thank you, Carlene. Off to Eastern Washington, where, to the surprise of many there, U.S. Representative Kathy McMorris Rodgers announced earlier this month that she wouldn't seek re-election. Since then, anyone with an R after their name is east of the Cascades has at least considered to run for the seat. Even some Democrats are interested in the office, potentially representing the seat that could hand Democrats the gavel in Washington Washington, D.C.'s People's Chamber. Eastern Washington reporter Randy Brock is here with us. What's the official tally up to at this point, Randy?
We're up to 8 now who have declared their candidacies, but it's a new day and there's still rumors of more potential candidates willing to join into the fray.
Who's officially in so far?
Well, let's start with the 3 Democrats because each of them had announced their candidacies prior to Representative Rogers saying she would not seek re-election. The trio includes Dr. Bernadine Bank. She's a physician living in the small community of Colbert, Northeast Washington. And there's 2 Spokane area residents, Carmela Conroy and Anne Marie Danimus. Conroy is a former chair of the Spokane Democratic Party and a longtime deputy prosecutor for the county. Danimus operates a local marketing firm, and she's been involved in a number of civic organizations. And they would all be newcomers to elected public office.
And it's the GOP side that seems to be getting really crowded. What's their collective experience?
Well, of the 5 right now, 3 currently hold elective office. The 2 exceptions are John Gunther and Renee Holliday. Gunther's a recently retired state employee in Spokane who ran in 2020 against for the U.S. Senate and finished a distant 4th to incumbent Patty Murray. Holliday is a radio personality on the Liberty Broadcasting System. She's a former legislative aide, and she was an unsuccessful candidate for the Stevens County Board of Commissioners.
And the other 3 GOP candidates in office now, who are they?
In alphabetical order, they're Jonathan Bingle. He's a Spokane City Councilman since 2022. He and his wife operate a custom events planning business. He's also worked as a general contractor and served as a pastor. The second one is Brian Dansel of Republic. He's currently a Ferry County Commissioner. He's also a former state legislator and a former director of the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Farm Service Agency in Washington State. And then we have Jacqueline Maycumber. She's also from the small town of Republic. She's served in the State House as a representative from the 7th Legislative District since 2017.
And now there are whispers of other potential contenders out there, right? I know that the former Spokane Mayor Nadine Woodward is being rumored or told the Spokesman Review that she's interested in a potential run.
That's the word. And Spokane County Treasurer Michael Baumgartner, he's a Republican and a former state senator. He said publicly that he's at least considering a possible bid. So if those 2 jump in, you'll have enough for a baseball team.
Minus the DH, obviously. What's the district built like? I mean, in terms of the Cook political voter index, historically, which way do the district's voters normally vote? And what are issues, for the candidates and constituents that they deem important?
Well, from a geographic standpoint, this district is huge. It includes all or parts of 12 eastern Washington counties. It goes from the Canadian border south to Oregon. It's bordered on the east by the state of Idaho. It's mostly a rural mix of timber, mining, and ranching interests up north, which is definitely conservative. You could call it Donald Trump country. Right. Down south in the Palouse region, it's also conservative. There's a lot of dryland wheat farmers down there. Within the city of Spokane, it's the state's 2nd largest city. It's got over 230,000 residents, and it's trended liberal Democrat in recent years.
Well, we will definitely keep up on this. That is going to be a race to watch coming up after the Congresswoman's surprising exit from office. And a big thank you to all of our journalists for sharing their stories. Stay up to date with these and more at thecentersquare.com. I'm Cole Lauterbach, and until next time, this has been Washington in Focus.